Hello, welcome back. Today we'll have our first of 3 or 4 lectures on the Hindu traditions. It's good to be with you. Hope you're doing well, and hope if you have any questions, again, please do reach out to me throughout the semester in our time together. So what I want to say from the get-go is, with each of the religious traditions we look at, the Hindu tradition, Buddhist traditions, the Jewish traditions, Christian traditions, and Muslim traditions. With each of them, our first lecture, we have 3 or 4 lectures in each tradition. And our first lecture is going to cover the basics in terms of what was the historical geographical context from within these religious traditions emerged. Like, from what soil did they kind of grow out of, right? We'll talk about that. That's always important. We have to put a place, right, a location to each of these traditions as far as their origins go. And also in the first lecture, we'll talk about the naming of these religious traditions. That's always an important question. Um, that we'll talk about that, but like the importance of who names these religions for what purposes, and why does that matter? Why should we think about that? Is something we'll get into a little bit. And what else? First lecture, we'll talk about sacred text. So within each of these religious traditions, there's sacred texts which are foundational and important that guide the communities in different ways. And we'll talk about kind of the founding figures. So for example, Muhammad, right? The seal of the prophets within the Islamic tradition, are Buddha, and within the obviously the Buddhist tradition, and Jesus of Nazareth within the Christian tradition, Abraham within the Jewish tradition, and of course, then thereafter the Christian and Muslim tradition. These figures will be covered within the first lecture as well. So that's what we'll talk about. And then from there, we have lectures on one lecture devoted to like the beliefs within the given religious tradition, and a lecture devoted to, say, the practices within a religious tradition, and then maybe another lecture about some like that points to maybe some of the internal diversities within the given tradition. So I hope that all makes general sense, and let's get on into it. Let's get on to it and discuss Hindu traditions. And first thing we want to talk about is, from where did this particular religious tradition, as we know it today, emerge? We know that the Hindu traditions and all their diversity. First, just to say, the Hindu traditions are the oldest religious tradition that we'll study in our time together. So it's been around for a very long time, and it's rooted in this area here. You can see, maybe you see this in this map, you see that river that's cutting down, that line there cutting down. The Indus River, a civilization formed around it, different villages, kind of networks of villages along this, really probably, I would imagine, very fertile soil around the Indus River. So you get these agrarian cultures that are thriving before you get what we know today as Hinduism, or the Hindu traditions. So we call this area here, it's called the Harappa culture. It's because if you look up here, go up the map a little bit, you'll see a town there called Harappa. And so it's named after that particular town on the India side of the Indus River. Looking at this map, the Harappa culture that emerged here is ancient civilization, which kind of is like at the nexus point between modern day Pakistan and India is where the Hindu tradition emerged out of. Okay, so at some point you move from like the practices or rituals, whatever existed prior to the Hindu traditions, and you get more to what becomes the Hindu traditions as we know it today. But it's not like there's a clean break between what existed prior to Hinduism within the Harappa culture and this ancient civilization and the Hindu traditions. There's a carryover. There's kind of a bleeding into, right? There's a continuity. So these continuities are important to trace to some extent and have an appreciation of. So for example, one continuity, in excavations that were done in the early 20th century, archaeological excavations around the Indus River in what is now today Pakistan. These excavations revealed people from the Harappa culture shared, again, similarities with the Hindu traditions, such as they had rooms for fire altars in houses. There were discovered carvings of a mother goddess, and there was a seal, an art seal on a wall, and it depicted a man in a yoga posture with the feet kind of crossed, right, crossed underneath you, sitting up upright, this kind of position. And so these are just some of the similarities, right, that we see. Okay, that there's some continuity. Perhaps we would expect that, right? There was some continuity between the ancient civilization that preceded what we call the Hindu traditions, and then within the Hindu traditions themselves. All right, so just briefly, often within the first lecture, within any religious tradition, we want to lay out also kind of a general kind of like time trajectory. And so when we talk about the Hindu traditions, taking a look here at this particular slide here, you can see the different major areas that we'll be covering in our time together. We're talking about the ancient civilization, when the Vedas, which is the oldest of the sacred texts within the Hindu tradition, were composed. So from the year 2500 to 600 before the Common Era. And then after that, the next era we move on to is, you can take a look, they're right here. Take a look. Let's just move on. All right, so let's talk about the authoritative text. The first authoritative text we want to talk about are the Vedas. The word Veda simply means wisdom. So the Vedas, these books of wisdom, these are technically, within the Hindu tradition, the most authoritative text. And we'll talk about the caste system when we talk about beliefs. But within the caste system, it's only the Brahmins, who are the priestly caste, who have the authority to interpret these texts, to teach from these texts. So these are really authoritative, sacred texts within the Hindu tradition. We'll also talk about, not in this particular lecture, but in the next lecture, because we're going to have a lecture devoted to Hindu epics. We'll talk about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which includes the Bhagavad Gita. And also another set of authoritative texts we'll briefly mention are the Puranas. So before we get into the Vedas, briefly talking about Hindu deities, which we'll return to when we talk about Hindu beliefs. But ultimately, within the Hindu tradition and Hindu philosophy, there is this recognition of a supreme being known as the ineffable, that is beyond speech, Brahman. So the Brahman is this overarching above every other, say, incarnation or avatar of God and other gods, is the supreme God that reigns above. So there's this notion. Also within in terms of Brahman is not limited by gender or number, and Brahman may take on countless forms, right? So this universal, ineffable Brahman, which is like, above all in the universe, is not confined to being just above. It could also come below and take on different forms, different incarnations, or different avatars. In classical rhetoric, typically there are some 330 million forms of the Brahman. And so with that, in some sectarian traditions, they're going to identify particular avatars, forms of the Brahman to be of the nature of being the supreme deity and thus worthy of devotion. So in the Hindu tradition, one is able to approach the Brahman through these different avatars, incarnations of, say, the Brahman, the deity here on earth. So we'll talk about that. So for example, important avatars are Vishnu and Shiva. And some will take the form of goddesses as well. So we'll talk about Vishnu and Shiva as we progress. The Supreme Being, as mentioned above, is not what's the word here, is not confined to gender. It could be understood in terms of male, female, androgynous, or obviously be beyond gender, which is often the ways that religious traditions understand the divine is beyond gender. Let's see. So yeah, and also within Hindu traditions, there's a lot of diversity. in a lot of different local communities have their own different deities that they worship as avatars that point to, in some ways, a Brahmin. All right, so just some quick noteworthy teachings. So, yeah, I know I mentioned that we want to get into the sacred texts, which we will, into the foundational figures, which we will. And speaking of foundational figures, and also in the first lecture, we kind of mentioned, again, gesture towards some teachings that we'll unpack more in future lectures. But going on to just quickly, like within these traditions, remember I talked about how we want to mention the important foundational figures, thinkers within these traditions. Within the Hindu tradition, we don't have this major significant one figure. So that's what's interesting and in some ways maybe different within the Hindu tradition. You have text, you have rituals, you have practices, you have beliefs, but there isn't like this one figure here on earth that people kind of turn towards. So there's no Muhammad, there's no Jesus, there's no Buddha, there's not that central figure in that way. But there are central teachings that come out of the sacred texts, the Vedas, the epics, which we'll talk about, the Puranas, the Upanishads, and so forth, which we'll talk about. But so from within these sacred texts, what gets teased out as some of the most noteworthy teachings, which we'll return to in the next lecture or two, is, for example, that Hindus generally recognize that there's a supreme being, variously conceived, personal for some and personal for others. And most think that the human soul is immortal, and they believe that when the soul reaches liberation, it will be freed from the shackles of karma in rebirth. Then, of course, like within any religious tradition, there are specific teachings that vary depending on sectarian tradition, region, and community. So where does the term Hinduism itself come from? That is this a term that the people who emerged around India and flourished from around the Indus River became what we now call the Hindu traditions? Did they themselves name themselves Hindus, or where did that name come from? Remember that we talked about people saying I am religious, I'm spiritual but not religious. The point I was trying to make is people do not like it or want to resist when other people name them, right? That's it. We want to resist that. And so the question is, well, is this name Hinduism? Is that a name that they came up with, or was it imposed upon them? What do you think? In this case, the name Hinduism, what comes from the river, right? The Indus River, right? It comes from the river, so that's where you get the name. It's a referencing a geographical location. The people who were living around this river, the Indus River, were called Hindus, and then that geographical naming it's migrated over and becomes also a form of religious naming. So this was a term. It was a term used by the outsider to describe those who were indigenous, native to the area around the Indus River. The British colonizers, when they arrived in India, they used the term Hinduism, to describe them. And they used the term Hindu to describe not only their location, but also to describe their what they perceived to be quote-unquote religious practices and beliefs. Now, to know, in terms of Indian law within the nation state of India, the term Hindu itself is this kind of all-encompassing term for all people Indian. It refers to, in other words, anyone who does not specifically identify with any particular religion, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They, by default, are classified as Hindu. Right? So Hindu is the overarching, I guess you could say, identifying marker of the people of India. But whereas you can opt out of that marker by identifying, for example, as a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. Hinduism is a limited term because it only says so much, and there's so much diversity within the Hindu traditions, but yet we still use this term as a place marker to describe this diversity within this that was birthed out of this location. Just one more, maybe Yeah, one more. Let's do one more kind of uh, general, general kind of teaching here. And basically, I want to talk about the term dharma. Dharma, dharma is the closest term within the Hindi language that comes close to the term Western term religion. So remember we talked about how the term religion itself is a modern Western academic invention. This is one case in point where there is no term religion as we imagine it within the lexicon of the Hindu people and Hindu traditions. The closest you get to that term is the term dharma, which refers to righteousness, our justice, our faith, or perhaps the best way to define the term dharma is duty. See, to know one's dharma and to do their dharma is their duty. It's how they fulfill their destiny. It's how they to do your duty is to do what you are supposed to do. So, for example, if one is in school and your duty is to do well in school, then you study, you make time to study, you make time to focus, you make sacrifices. Why? Because that's your dharma. That's what you are made to do. And to resist that thing which you are meant to do, that is to go against your dharma, and that is the last thing you would want to do as a Hindu. To be a Hindu, to be a good Hindu, means to understand your obligations and to faithfully carry them out and to do your duty, to do your dharma. So we'll talk about that. Dharma, your duty in part, is defined by your place within that social caste, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. So there you have it. Again, the naming of the Hindu traditions. The name Hindu comes out of the being located around the Indus River. It was a name applied by not just the British colonizers, but also by Persian invaders who came from Persia. They also use this kind of name in referencing the people around the Indus River as well. So it's a name to describe. It's a name applied from outsiders to describe the people who were located around this river too. We talked about Dharma, the importance of Dharma, and I think that's it, right? We talked about those two things. Let's see. We talked about the liberation. We'll talk about that more coming up next lecture or two. But the importance of karma and liberation and rebirth. All these are technical terms. Liberation means moksha. Rebirth means samsara. And karma and the importance of karma. Karma means like to do work. We'll talk about these things. We'll unpack karma. All this is important stuff. All of it's to be gotten to. But for now, let's kind of wrap up this particular lecture by talking about the Vedas. All right? I want to talk about the Vedas, and that's going to be it. So there's Vedas. Vedas means wisdom, and the Vedas are the oldest texts within the Hindu tradition. Within the Vedas, we have, again, these are 4 collections of hymns and texts. And within these hymns, these texts, these sacred texts, they are revealed. They are revealed to rishis, which means visionaries, through sight and sound. Rishis are important because they are a mediator, right? A mediator between the sacred text, the Vedas, and the people, the Hindus themselves. So the rishi is the one who receives that which is revealed through visions, or it could be revealed. The Vedas could be revealed through sacred words, known as the Shruti, which literally means that which is heard. So rishis and Shruti are 2 important intermediaries that receive and teach the Vedas. So the rishi, for example, is the one who saw the mantras, saw them visually, and they transmitted them to their disciples in an oral tradition. So that's one way by which the Vedas get passed down initially, is through an oral tradition. And you see this in many religious traditions. We'll see this, for example, in the Christian tradition, that the Gospels, the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that they were first initially orally transmitted from amongst and through different communities and cultures. And there was, of course, this was not anything near, say, within any of these traditions, say, like the equivalent of that game of I don't know if you know that game Telephone you play in elementary school. It's nothing like that. There's a lot of checks and balances, and we know cultural anthropologists. We know they know that in fact, oral traditions are very stable because they have checks and balances within them, and they have a certain level of preservation. And so we shouldn't we shouldn't imagine when we say oral tradition that we're talking about a tradition that was just running rampant in all different directions. Within textual traditions, as a matter of fact, you see variations as well. So there's no guarantee that variations do not happen as a tradition is passed on from one generation or one community to the next, but there are checks and balances. All that to say, oral traditions are important. In the Vedas, were initially passed on through oral tradition like other sacred texts. They were passed on from the rishis, again, the rishis who saw the mantras and they transmitted them, visually saw them, and then they transmitted them to their disciples in this oral tradition. There are 4 collections within the Vedas. The first collection is called the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda consists of songs about truth, reality, and the universe. One such example within this collection of Vedas is the creation hymn. The next set of Vedas is called the Yajur Vedas, and these Vedas contain rituals and sacrificial rites. Rituals and sacrificial rites. Within all religious traditions, we could say, to some extent, some more than others. But rituals and rites are foundational and important within religious traditions. And certainly, well, as one scholar says, one way, or maybe the best way to understand the Hindu tradition is to come to understand their rituals and practices. So it's very much a lived religion. The third Vedas is called the Sama Veda, and within this collection, you have songs dedicated to praising the gods, which are often set to music. So you could find on YouTube or somewhere else, you could find these songs are these Vedas being sung as hymns. The importance of singing within religious traditions is really interesting and fascinating. You see that across the religious traditions. We don't really focus on that, but it could be a whole. You could focus a whole class just looking at the importance of music and hymns and songs within religious traditions. The eminent German reformer Martin Luther in the 16th century is known for many things. One thing being like writing hymns. John Wesley, the founding father of what's called the Methodist Church, likewise, the Wesleys, John Charles Wesley, wrote hymns. Within the New Testament itself, most biblical scholars believe that the prologue of John, Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verse 1 through 14, is probably like a hymn. Or Philippians 2, 5 through 11, in the middle of the Apostle Paul's letter that he wrote when he was imprisoned. A lot of people believe that is a Christ hymn, a hymn that's circulated. When the first Christians, when the governor of Bithynia, his name was Pliny the Younger, when he wrote to Emperor Trajan, giving him a report of what he was seeing in Bithynia, which is Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, he asked for counsel from Emperor Trajan about how to handle or deal with these Christians. And you know how he described these Christians? He said they hang out, they chill. Well, not exactly like that. And he said they sing hymns to Jesus as if he is God. Again, so early on, they were singing hymns. Hymns are foundational within any religious tradition. Like, in part, you are what you sing. There is this saying called lex credendi, lex orandi. The law of praying is the law of believing. So what you pray is what you believe. You're shaped by the words you utter, by your prayers. You're also shaped by that which comes out of your mouth in the form of song. Wow, I'm sorry, that was a lot. All I'm trying to say is that Sama Veda is the third collection of books within the Vedas, and they're set to music. And being set to music is an important theme. The use of music is an important theme across religious traditions. On to the fourth Veda. The fourth Veda is the Atharva Veda. In the Atharva Veda, this collection of sacred texts consists of curses and charms. Some of these are pretty interesting and fun, such as there's one charm within this set of Vedas that is a charm on love. So if you want to, if you have that unrequited love towards another, you could chant this particular charm in hopes of procuring the love, getting the love from that person you so desire. Or there's another Veda within this collection of curses and charms, the Atharva Vedas, which is the gambler's prayer. Artha Veda 7, which is as it sounds, which is a prayer for those who need assistance, want favor when it comes to rolling the dice, so to speak. So I think I would like to just kind of wrap this up, if I may, giving examples of some of these Vedas, and we'll call this a lecture. Okay. So first, I mentioned that within the first set of Vedas, the Vedas are called the Rig Veda. These are songs about truth, reality, and universe. And I mentioned a creation hymn. And the creation hymn, here we have it, we'll call it in our kind of idiom, Rig Veda chapter 10, verse 129. Here in the first collection of Vedas, the Rig Vedas, you get the creation hymn. I just want to read it, give you a sense of what some of the things and teachings that are located within these ancient sacred texts. So the creation hymn reads, "There was neither non-existence nor existence then. There was neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond. What steered? Where? And whose protection? Was there water bottomlessly deep? Was there below? Was there above? There were seed placers, there were powers. There was impulse beneath. There was giving forth above. Who really knows? Who were here to proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is the creation? The gods came afterwards, the creation of this universe. Who then knows hence it has arisen? Whence this creation has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows. The one who looks down on the highest heaven, that's Brahman. Remember we talked about briefly Brahman being like the god above the gods, if you will. Like that which is above everything is Brahman. And then you have these different manifestations of the gods which are subordinate to Brahman. So that which is the highest, he who is in the highest heaven, it's he who knows, it's the Brahman that knows. Or perhaps Brahman does not know. So you see this creation hymn, the point where it's taken us to, it's asking these questions. What steered? Where? Whose protection? Talks about the bottomlessly deep, from below, from above. Who knows? Who could proclaim it? And so it's kind of shifting it. It's asking questions, which could be a form of faithfulness. And sometimes when you ask questions, you get answers, but sometimes you don't. And within this hymn, it's saying, ask the questions about where did this all come from, and recognize who knows. You don't. I don't. Perhaps Brahman knows, or perhaps not. Creation hymn, out of the Rig Veda. Pretty good stuff. Another hymn. This hymn's important. I think I'll mention it now, and definitely I'll reference it when we talk about the caste system within the Hindu traditions. This is the hymn of the Supreme Person. The hymn of the Supreme Person, it also comes out of the Rig Veda, the first collection of Vedas. So briefly, I'll read it and just unpack it quickly. But what you get here is you get an account that describes how the universe itself was created through the cosmic sacrifice of the primeval man named Purusha. So you have within the Jewish tradition, within the Islamic tradition, and Christian tradition, the primeval man is Adam. Within the Hindu tradition, the primeval man is Purusha. And so Purusha is sacrificed. So we know within different traditions, such as at the center of how salvation is understood in the Christian tradition is the sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth. We know that sacrifice was important within the area, the Second Temple Judaism, for example. So sacrifice is an important theme in different traditions. Here in the Hindu tradition, we see how sacrifice played an important role, ROLE, in the creation of social caste as we have them today. So here are just a few of the verses from the hymn of the Supreme Person coming out of the Vedas. The cosmic person, Purusha, has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes and feet. It covers the earth on all sides and extends 10 finger lengths beyond. Cosmic person is everything all that has been and will be. On to verse 12. From his mouth, meaning the mouth of Purusha, came the priestly class. From his arms, the rulers. The producers came from his legs, and from his feet came the servant class. From his mind came the moon from his eye, the sun Indra and Agni. These are ancient deities within Hindu tradition, by the way, Indra and Agni, which we will not talk about in our time together because they're not as popular today. We'll talk about avatars such as Vishnu and so forth. Anyhow, the sun, Indra and Agni, from his mouth. The wind came from his breath. From his navel came space from his head. The sky from his feet. Earth from his ears. The four directions. So, I could have read that better. Anyhow, so this is an important hymn because it is used to reference and it provides kind of a textual rationale for for substantiating the institution, if you will, the practice, if you will, of the caste system. As you can see within this primordial, I can't say that word. I'm gonna say primordial man, primordial man, Purusha. You can see that within the dividing them up, right? The heads, that is one caste. The arms symbolize another caste. The legs, the third, and the feet, ultimately the servant caste. We want to talk about that later. Just wanted to point to this hymn and kind of point to some of the ways in which you can see some of the central teachings or some of the major teachings within Hindu tradition are found within these ancient texts. The gambler's prayer is great. You know what? We're going to end this lecture with the gambler's prayer. So the gambler's prayer comes out of the fourth collection of Vedas, that collection of Vedas being the Atharva Vedas. The Atharva Veda has, again, curses and charms, such as I mentioned, there's a love charm one could invoke. Let me know if you want that Veda now, send it your way. All right, so the gambler's prayer. The gambler's prayer. Here we go. The gambler's prayer, as just a few parts of it, get a sense of it. As evermore the lightning flash strikes, irresistible, the tree. So irresistible, may I conquer the gamblers with the dice. Verse 3, I pray to Agni, again the ancient deity, him who guards his treasure, here, won by homage, may he pile on our winnings. Astrea with racing cars, I bring my presents. Duty with reverence, let me laud the Maruts. Yea, by superior play one gains advantage. In time he piles his spoil as doth a gambler. He overwhelms with wealth's inherent powers the devotee who keeps not back his riches. My right hand holds my winnings fast, and in my left is victory. I would that I were winner of cattle and horses, wealth and gold. Dice! Give me play that bringeth fruit, as 12 a cow with flowing milk. And as the bowstring binds the bow, unite me with a stream of gains. All right, so there you have it. We introduced ourselves to what? The location, the Indus civilization, in that ancient civilization that existed as far back as 2500 BCE. And we noted that out of this civilization, at some point, we start getting these sacred texts, such as the Vedas. Then we get other texts and epics, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Then we get practices and rituals and beliefs that are, brought in contact with these sacred texts. And this is, by the time you get, say, the Persians coming to the Indus Valley, and certainly by the time you get the British colonizers coming, right? In the, say, 18th century, by the time British colonizers are coming, these texts have been circulating, been practiced, taught, interpreted, put into play, and they've usually led to these diverse groups of different communities that together the British look at and call, okay, yes, forget the differences, let's loop them all together and collectively call these people Hindu. And so then with that, you get plugged into national law in India, right, which is in part in conversation with the British colonizers. You get the very category Hindu used by them to say, as I mentioned, that anyone who is not a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, who belongs to one of these formal world religions is de facto a Hindu. So that's the way you see this term itself, right? Anyways, we'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'll be back in touch with the next lecture coming up shortly. Be well. Any questions, as always, please do let me know. Thank you so much.